Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I think that we're live right now. Everything seems to be working technically. I hope that you're able to hear me. And we're joined today by Tom Kail from Inkle, with whom we're going to have a great chat about game design. And actually trying a new format today, which is a presentation. So we're going to be talking. We're going to start with Tom talking a bit about himself and the work that he does at Inkle, as well as the work that he's done independently. And then he's going to do a really great presentation on game design. And then we can talk more about game design towards the end of this. So hi there, Tom. How are you today? Uh, let's see. Can you say something else? Just wanted to make sure that this works.
Best known of which is probably the latest Heaven's Vault or else 80 Days.
Oh, could you say that again? You're now
Yeah.
now your audio works.
Oh, okay, cool. So, hi, I'm Tom. I am a developer at Inkle. We make story games, the latest of which is Heaven's Vault, which came out on PlayStation in April and has already been nominated for a whole bunch of awards. It's a space archaeology game where you explore the ruins of lost civilizations and translate ancient languages.
And exploration is a really big part of that game. I mean, I remember coming to your office and learning about this ancient language that I had to actually decode, and then I flew in a ship or sailed in a ship on these cosmic sand time water particles.
Yeah, we call them rivers of starlight.
Right. Who's that?
That's the cat. I'd pick her up, but then she'd move.
Fair, fair. So, how long have you been with Inkle, and what has your experience been like? Because you're based in Cambridge, right?
Sorry, we're in Cambridge, yeah. So I've been there for 5 years, ages now, and it's wonderful. We're a small indie studio, and we're very focused on doing one thing that a lot of studios don't do. We're entirely story focused. So rather than starting with a mechanic or a theme or something like that, we start with the story, and everything that we do is based around that first. So we have a story, and then we say, okay, well, what sort of mechanics would fit the role that the player is going to be in, and critically won't slow the game down? Like, how do we make sure that everything serves the story? How does all of this gameplay actually enrich the story rather than just serving as a distraction from it or something else to do, or like a way to justify having loots or a way to gain resources? None of that stuff interests us unless it serves the story.
And I mean, I can imagine how narrative design would be a really big part in this, right? But how do you do game design in a game like this? Because while I played, you obviously had quite a lot of systems which were working together. You had this wonderful robotic companion, and then you had the whole mini game, I guess, which is like the main gameplay of the main puzzle gameplay of the game, which was figuring out ancient civilization language, right?
Yeah, right. So the language game worked really, really well for us. So we knew that this was a game where you were going to play as an archaeologist, and we had a good think about what an archaeologist does. And we knew we weren't going to do, the classic gamer archaeologist thing, which is running around shooting stuff and destroying ancient artifacts, because we wanted a game where you really do play as an archaeologist rather than playing as Indiana Jones. And what's really nice about language is that it's inherently meaningful. When you translate something that you find on the side of a building or maybe inscribed on a key, you like where you found it is important and probably is related to what that thing says. Everything is sort of relevant, I suppose. And then, when you read what's written on, say, that key, it will tell you something about the space that you're in. So reading the language is definitely, gameplay in the sort of proper sense of the word, and it was designed to be, engaging and like a sort of distraction, I suppose, from just sort of wandering around doing the classic adventure game style game. But fundamentally, it serves the story first.
So, are any of you guys archaeologists? How did you do your research for that?
No, although John, who's our writer and game designer, his wife is an anthropologist, which I think helped a fair bit. But really, we just sort of studied a lot of archaeologists. There was a wonderful archaeologist, an Egyptian archaeologist, who's currently active trying to preserve artifacts that were looted during the Arab Spring. I've forgotten her name, but she was wonderful. And she was a really big inspiration for our character, Elia.
That's really interesting. Sorry about that that time lapse. And tell me a bit more about your role. Like you've been quite involved in this game because you joined just as production was starting, right?
Yeah, I started just before. Sort of, I joined the company right after 80 days, which was a real success for us. And immediately after that, we were kind of doing, ports and working on finishing up the Sorcery series as well. But sort of percolating in the background as soon as I joined was kind of, what's going to be the next big thing. And so I was initially doing some really early prototypes for Heaven's Vault, none of which resembled the game at all. Um, but were nonetheless sort of really important for helping us work out what the hell it was that we were going to make. There's probably even some shreds of code that are still left over in the final code base. But Heaven's Vault was a really long project, actually. It was easily the longest that I've ever worked on. It's been 3 or 4 years in the end, depending on when you count production and prototyping phases and this sort of thing. So I've mostly just been working on that, although we were working on a few things in the background the whole time, one of which was the Switch port for 80 days, which I'm happy to say we finally announced yesterday, which will be coming out on the 1st October.
Oh wow, that's really great. I mean, to everybody who has a Switch, by all means, I'm guessing it's something that's worth playing if you haven't played 80 Days yet.
It really is. I joined Inkle because I played 80 Days on iOS, which is where it was originally released, and thought, wow, this is bloody brilliant. It's, in my humble opinion, and of course slightly biased opinion, I think it's the best piece of interactive fiction ever made. I think it's really brilliant. And utterly worth studying if you're interested in seeing how stories can be told effectively interactively. If you can't wait, play it on iOS, but you should absolutely wait for the Switch version, in my opinion. Of course, again, unbiased, it is the best version out there.
See, I'm waiting for the Android version.
There's an Android version, you can go grab it now.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll stop what we're doing and do that. I'll probably do it after this talk. So one thing that I wanted to show you, which no other speaker has seen yet, because these are literally hot off the 3D printer or the laser cutter, is I wanted to show you what we've been doing to say thank you to our speakers, because you guys accept to do these talks in your own time. So we now actually have some really pretty small cards that are going to be mailed to you. So this is Ryan Brown from Numbskull. This is Adrian Simple from the Gaming Observer, who we talked with recently. We have Felicia Pren, who we had our last chat with, Taylor, and Pauline, who we had our first Game Anglia talk with. And then this is you. See, it says Tom Kail here. So,
Christ, I hope I don't ruin it for you.
And yeah, I mean, it comes with a nice little stand. So I'm going to send this to you, and hopefully you can enjoy your trophy for participating in the Game Anglia talks.
Oh, that's very kind.
But yeah, it's our way of saying thank you to everybody who's been helping us build this community and making these talks amazing. And yeah, tell us a bit about your talk tonight, and if let me know when you want me to make your screen public visible.
So I want to talk in a sort of vague and unfocused way about sort of a fundamental thing that players do when they play games that we don't really talk about very often or really at all, actually, and it's called reading. And it's this thing that you do, when you play a game, the first thing you do is you work out what the hell is going on here. Like, what am I looking at? What do I need to know? And this happens long before you start saying, okay, what do I want to do with this information that I've gathered, and how am I going to do it? Can I click the buttons fast enough? And the funny thing about, I call this reading. Just like you read a book, you literally parse the words on screen and you make sense of them. The funny thing about this is that we don't really think of it as being gameplay because there aren't really any decisions to be made. You're just making sense of information. But it's absolutely a skill that you learn as you play games, and learning skills is inherently fun and is a massive part of why we play games at all. And we don't often realize that actually a lot of games are literally entirely reading. So without spoiling too much, when you think of, I don't know, like Where's Wally? There are no decisions to be made in Where's Wally. It's literally just, can I spot the thing? And there are a lot of games out there that are largely, can I spot the thing? Even in the hardcore space. If you think of, I don't know, a game like Uncharted, a lot of really what you're doing, like the actual button pressing is often not difficult. But a lot of what you're doing is really just working out where the path is. Where's the next glowing ledge that I need to find? So it's almost a hidden object game. And it's this kind of form of gameplay that we don't often think about. So I'm kind of just going to talk about some interesting observations related to this concept.
Yeah, sure. Let's get this started. Do you want me to share your screen then?
Okay, I'll switch over. Okay, are we ready?
Yeah, all good. Go.
Wonderful. All right, so I'm going to start with an exercise. What I'm going to do is I'm going to throw up some images and some short clips from some popular games up on the screen. What I'd like you to do is simply to understand what's going on. I don't want you to think about what you do next, but rather just get a sense of what's happening, who's playing, who's winning, what might happen next. So let's go. I'm going to leave these up on screen for a while and sort of pay attention to how your eye dots around the screen make sense of information. See any interesting strategies? What catches your eye? There's a lot more going on in this one. Can you tell how far the game is along? Can you tell whose turn it is? Can you see what moves are left to the player to perform? Right here, is the player in any danger? How are they going to get over that pipe? If you know that Yoshi's wings allow you to tap the A button to fly, that changes how you're going to respond to that. A player who knows that they can do that, this problem is very simple, but if you don't know that, you probably assume that you're going to go under the pipe, in which case you're going to have to deal with those red spiky things. Are we going to have a video?
I haven't played the League in such a long time.
They keep changing the UI. So were you able to follow that? Frankly, it's the biggest question. Do you understand what's going on? League of Legends is a really complicated game. And it's not something I would necessarily expect of somebody who hasn't played it, although you might be able to follow the basic action. You probably understand the idea of a health bar. You probably understand, red versus blue. And another one. Again, do you think you know who's winning?
But you have to know the rules for that one, right?
Yeah, right. So that's a really interesting thing about it. It's not like, so League of Legends, you can, even if you don't really know how to play League of Legends, you probably still, understand that you can walk around the space by watching it. And you understand that, that health bar, when it depletes, they probably die. There's a lot of things that you can assume, but chess, less so. We all have some basic gaming literacy, but, there might be enough to understand that maybe they can move around this grid, but you certainly wouldn't know how, or you wouldn't be able to parse what the symbols were. All right, one more example. Oops. He wants to play. So I think this is a really interesting one because it's in first person. It's far harder to tell what's going on. So if you're paying attention to the top right, you'll just see that his team got wiped out. But if you were watching him, you'd assume he was doing really quite well. But it looks like that's cost him the game. did you know that the game was about to end? It's the sort of thing that you need to, some games you need to follow them far longer before they make sense. Whereas a game like this, you kind of know everything that you need to know just by looking at a single screenshot of it. Overwatch, that 30-second clip I showed you, probably wasn't enough to gain all the information that you needed. And that's partly because it's real time, but it's also because a lot of information happens off screen or in the past. So, what I've asked to focus on is what I call reading, and it's simply the act of understanding information that's being presented. I think it's something that developers don't talk about very often, and I think it helps us to better understand what makes the games that we play and make interesting. And I'm going to talk about what reading is and how it affects how we play games from a few different perspectives. So, some initial observations from the clips I was showing you. You probably noticed that some of these games were really hard to understand, while others you could follow what was being presented. Some of them might have been enjoyable to follow, and in others you might have been frustrated by the lack of information or confused by a situation that you couldn't really understand. There might be some games that you'd never played, but you still felt that you were able to follow, maybe just a little. So games train us how to read them, but a lot of what we learn can still be carried over into other games. So this is what's called the player feedback loop, and this is kind of how players take information and decide what they're going to do. So the game presents its information, and then what I've highlighted in red here, this is reading, this is observation, where they look at what's on screen or in front of them, or they listen to what's going on, and the player makes observations based on what they know about the game. Then they plan the potential solution to the problem, and then they make a move, and if it's successful, then they get a reward. If it's not, then they don't. And then the loop repeats. So effectively, this is read, plan, and execute. And these are the three things that players actually do when they play a game in the abstract. And I think we mostly talk about planning and we talk about executing. We don't really talk about reading, even though it's really, really important. If you read poorly, then your plan is based on bad information. If your plan is flawed, then your execution isn't going to help you win the game. So we'll come back to how games use reading, planning, and execution to keep us engaged later. But first, I want to dig into what reading is and how players do it. So let's play a game. I'm going to show you something, and I'd like you not to read it. That's how you win. That's all you have to do. Oh, well, you tried, right? You really tried, but you can't do it. Let's try something different. If you see the face, then you lose. You saw the face, right? So this is called pareidolia.
Yeah.
And we're so good at recognizing faces that we literally can't help but see them in places like first. The first thing you saw here was probably a face. And then you probably saw, oh, it's a house. Because we're better at recognizing faces than houses, significantly so. All right, one more. If you know who's won, then you've failed. I think we often overlook just how incredible it is that we can see like a few shapes on a screen and we can instantly recognize it as a particular game and then understand the state of that game. That's amazing. Like, this is really abstract what I'm showing you. It's a bunch of circles and crosses. There's the information that's conveyed here is incredibly specific, and you grokked it straight away, despite probably not having played this since you were 5. So, sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, the reason why you don't end up playing noughts and crosses is because after a while you get so good at reading that you understand what the dominating strategies are in it, right?
Yes, I think you also get good at planning. You understand the effect of doing a move, which I think is more in the planning camp. But certainly reading is important, right? I mean, reading is the reason that you might lose a game is because you literally didn't spot it. So you notice, I mean, adults will notice this when they play Connect 4, which is basically the same game with gravity and 4 instead of 3. You'll sometimes lose a game because you literally didn't spot that they had 3 in a row diagonally and then they've just added the 4th one. You didn't see it. And that's why you lost the game. And that wasn't a failure of planning or a failure of executing. It was a failure to spot the thing. And I think that's a really, really important distinction, actually, because the reasons that we win and lose games, and the reasons that we improve at games are not always because we learn to deal with the situation better. It's literally that we understand that there's a situation there at all.
I mean, it's really interesting when you look at games which have split-second decisions, right? If you think why a lot of people complain about first-person shooters, multiplayers, something like Counter-Strike or Rainbow Six Siege, is that they didn't even see who shot at them. So that's not always because like your opponent is using a bot, but rather because they got so good at reading that map or reading where you are on the screen that they quickly understood where you were going to be and predicted that.
No, that's perfect. That's exactly right. It's a perfect segue into this next slide, which is patterns, which is that when we learn things, we kind of internalize patterns, which is more than just like the symbol of understanding that X is me and circle is them. And it's understanding these abstract things. For example, that if they have two in a row, you need to pay attention here, or that maybe they often play in this space and you need to know how to deal with it. Like if you're playing rock, paper, scissors and somebody's often playing rock, that's a pattern that you sort of internalize, and you might not even be necessarily aware of it always. You just kind of learn this thing. And in a first-person shooter, certainly that might be, there tends to be a sniper on that balcony, and you learn to read that. You're not even consciously planning to do that. You just kind of learn that this is a thing that happens. Or understanding how much damage that sniper rifle does. So something that might have been conscious thought becomes what Raf Costa, who's a very good game designer, calls sort of grokking. This sort of sense of really understanding something, like internalizing it to the point where you don't even consider it, you just do it. And I think that's effectively what my reading example was meant to show, is that even though at some point you had to consciously study those words and think about what they meant and how they related to the words before and after them, now you don't have to do that. You just read it, you see it, and then you know what it means. And this happens in games as well. So it enables us to understand these incredibly complicated things without really having complex thought at all. And we notice this in learning languages as well. So how language works is still really hotly debated, but it seems that we learn partly by evaluating a new thing against something that we already know. So if you're an English speaker learning French, you're able to pick out familiar patterns, like, the characters look similar. That's actually really quite a lot. And also there are some words that have similarities, and, we expect there to be E's at the end of things. That makes sense to us.
Yeah, English words like aubergine. Sorry.
Sorry, Nick, come on.
Well, it's interesting when you end up borrowing words that coming from a different culture, you're like, oh, that word means the exact same thing here. And as you were saying, you end up hearing something and there's a click in your mind being like, oh, wait, that wasn't in this language. It was in this other language that I know. And suddenly you understand a bit more about like the culture or about how that word kind of like traveled around the world.
Right, yeah, exactly. And I think that's that's a really wonderful example, actually. Like, it's this sort of shortcut that we have that allows us to quickly comprehend new things. And it is a shortcut. Like, it's not that it's necessarily allowing you to understand something innately. Like, when you first start learning French, you don't think in French like a French person does. You think by looking at some French, translating it to English, and then understanding it in English. And it's only when you have this true understanding of something that you're able to comprehend it in those terms without this kind of intermediary step, this relative thing of saying, French to English, then to understanding. But on the other hand, it's way, way, way harder when something doesn't look anything like something we know. So, for example, we probably understand that the letters that I put up on the screen there, you probably understand that those are writing. And you probably also understand that the spaces mean that the things between them are words. But you're probably not going to get anything else from that at all. Like, even if you sat there and studied it, you just can't comprehend anything from that. And so it becomes almost uninteresting to us. Something that we don't have a handle on becomes either frustrating or just uninteresting to us. And this is true of the language of games as well. So gamers have played hundreds of games and don't need to be introduced to what are really actually quite weird concepts, like the idea of a health bar or experience points. And these crop up in, most games in some form. That's weird, right? Like this idea that when you die, or, that your health exists, that, if you get shot in the leg, you don't just lose your leg and have to crawl around. No, your health goes down a bit. And when that hits 0, you die, but don't worry, you come back. Or like experience points. That's really weird. That's abstract. It's not really how the game works. Like if I kill a sheep, I don't get experience points in life. Like I don't even necessarily get that much better at killing sheep. So the effect of an increasingly literate audience is increasingly complex games and also increasingly hardcore genres. So just like reading a book, literacy is the skill that is required to access the content. Expecting players to learn or already have the literacy required to read a game can be intimidating, and it can reduce the size of a game's audience quite a lot. And this might not be a bad thing, right? I mean, like you can produce an incredibly sophisticated game for a very, highly literate audience in the same way that, jazz music is largely noise to me, like, the really out there stuff. But to a trained ear, it's incredible and there is so much to pick up. I literally don't know what I'm looking for. I don't have the palette for it. I don't have the understanding that it takes to appreciate something. And that's fine. And that's the process of learning a medium, is that you start recognizing these familiar patterns in it, and then you look for something more complicated. And this is how games in general has evolved with their audience. And this allows developers to build increasingly complicated things because they're building from this common base. We can assume that the audience understands this thing. So although languages are typically a lot harder they're a lot complicated than games are, right? Like languages are ridiculous. Games are often way harder to read. And admittedly, this is partly because like we've been reading words for a really long time. Like words are really weird. But language is still, it's got some rules that make it easy to read, right? Like it's written in order, for example, and you read each word one at a time. Like it's designed to be read, like consciously designed to be read. The characters deliberately look different from each other. But games don't have that, right? Like games are often deliberately really hard to read. So often you have information that's deliberately hidden from the player. So you have to guess, or it's off screen, or maybe it happened in the past. And like if this happened in a language, it'd be nuts. It would make it almost impossible to use without like having to puzzle over it. But that's what we want in a game. The brain is designed to spot patterns, and it's something that we find inherently fun to do because of this. Like it's a true instinct of ours, and it's something that we are inherently rewarded for, is just spotting patterns. And we don't often think of reading as being that important to gameplay, but by this I mean reading is gameplay. Reading is inherently fun to do. So I want to show you some examples of what I mean by this. So this is a hidden object game, right? This tests our ability to find objects in a space. It is reading. I'm looking for stuff. It's pretty abstract. I'm just told to find this thing. There's no, decisions to make. I can't really do it wrong. I just have to look until I find the thing. But looking for it is rewarding, right? These games are popular because we like to search for things. It's that instinct of looking for a tiger in a bush. Our brain has evolved to find that fun because it's good for our survival. And one that we might recognize more is Where's Wally, right? Like it's the same game. It's arguably more complex in some ways. There's definitely more going on. But it's the same thing. We're just trying to spot stuff. A jigsaw puzzle is pretty similar, except for they're also searching for the shapes in the pieces as well. And there might be a little bit of strategy to how we do it. You start with the edges, but 90% of what you're doing in this game is you're looking for stuff. A word search. This is slightly more interesting. So this tests how well we're able to spot the patterns found in a language. And these are ridiculously complicated. If I gave you a piece of paper and said, write down all of the rules to language, it would drive you mad. Linguists can't really work this stuff out. There's loads of confusing stuffs like I's before E's, except after these. And something to notice about these is that although the words are deliberately made hard to find, like that's literally the game, the individual characters are made as easy as possible to tell apart. you can imagine a version of this game where the rows are slightly jiggly and the L's are all written just slightly differently, so that it's a little bit harder to read, right? Or maybe they're
No,
like painted
please
the colors.
don't. I mean, that's really interesting, but no, please don't.
Right, it would ruin the game. It would, right? It would consciously make the game worse. And that's because this is a game about finding patterns, and by making the patterns, well, by making the units that make the patterns harder to find, you're making the game harder to play, but not for the right reasons. And I think there's a really interesting distinction there. But I'll get back to that. So Solitaire is slightly different, but it's very similar to the last one in some ways. So this one does provide us with choices. But there's rarely a choice that matters in Solitaire. Solitaire is arguably more of a gamey game than the other ones I've presented here. Like, people are more likely to consider this to be a proper game, for whatever that means. But no, there's no choices here. There's nothing to plan for. Like, you can occasionally, put the 8 on this one or that one, but I don't think anyone would claim that makes much difference. Or if it does, you wouldn't have known that it makes much difference because everything else is hidden. But like the word search, the cards are specifically designed to be easy to read, right? I mean, this is a quality of a deck of cards. Like, the 8 is written plainly on it. There are 8 symbols. Like, it's really very easy to read innately. So the challenge in this game is finding cards that are related to each other by their numerical order. And you'll notice that this is a quality found in most card games, actually, is they're just about spotting a pattern between the cards. So a key element of poker is working out which hands might be possible. So if I've got a 2 and a 4, I might know that I could, or maybe I've got 2 and 2 4s, right? So then I could go for a 3, and that says, oh, maybe I could go for a run. Or maybe I've got 2 4s, so that's something in itself, but maybe I could get another one. Like, there are lots of patterns that fall out of this, and each of them have a likelihood. And literally just understanding that there are patterns to be found and this is what they look like, that is a form of reading.
Well, and I mean, in a lot of these games, so Solitaire is one of them. Poker is another one. A really big part of the game is interpreting hidden information, right? So
Yeah.
with Solitaire, in the screenshot that you have there, either of the 8s that you move are going to be exactly the same in terms of what are the odds that a certain card is under them, but you won't be able to make like an informed choice about which of them would be better to actually move, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. And it's funny because, like, in a lot of cases, we probably consider this to be a flaw in the game design, right? That, like, this game is constantly giving us these apparent choices that aren't really, well, they're not interesting choices by any metric. But this is an immensely popular game, so it's quite hard to argue that the game is wrong and that we need to make it better somehow. I think, actually, the real argument is that players who play Solitaire aren't looking to play a game where they have to make lots of interesting decisions. They're looking to play a game where they have to spot patterns between numbers. They're looking to exercise this reading, right? So the last card example I have is Snap, which is literally just, can you tell that these 2 numbers are the same, except for it's timed and against somebody else, right? So it doesn't take much, actually, in terms of reading to be entertaining. There are lots of ways to just sort of, like, you add timing or you throw a few different types of hands in, and you have something that is entertaining in itself. So here's another one where the symbols are deliberately made really easy to tell apart. Notice how they're all different colors, different shapes. It's really, really done really well. And it makes the thing that we're really looking for less frustrating to find. So we're looking to find matches of 3s, and the game is helping us to do that by making it really easy for us to say, okay, show me all of the reds, and you can kind of, your brain can always pull that out. You can see them, and you can see that there's nothing, and you can do reds,
Yes,
right?
but
And you can
that's
just
not
tell
the
that really
goal
quite
here.
quickly. But you have to look for it, right?
And that's not necessarily the goal, right?
Sorry?
That's not necessarily the goal. Like, being able to tell, for example, that you might have, I don't know, the 3 blues at the top, right? Top left.
Yeah.
If you match those, as opposed to finding the arguably harder to find vertical 3 purple there, slightly lower, that one would be the much better move. But at the same time, we know that the goal is to get, in this particular game, the goal is to get the cherries and the acorns down to the bottom. So a lot of the time, you can have this weird pattern where the game designer is going to make the game easy to read, but for the wrong reasons.
Yes, yeah, I think that's really interesting. Something else that occurred to me when I was thinking about this type of game in particular is that it's really interesting that a skilled player could plan several turns ahead in this kind of game, right? Like, I could just sit here and work it out, and because there's really not very much information, and because I'm trying to get the cherry to the bottom, so what comes out from the top doesn't really matter to me, I could sit here and I could work out exactly how I'm going to win. I could think 10 turns ahead, and I could say, right, checkmate in 5 moves or whatever. But no one does that. And I think that's really interesting in itself. Like, partly these games aren't incentivizing you to do that, or if they are, not particularly heavily, it's easier just to play the game. But it's not very fun to do. And actually, I think that's probably the real reason. But I'll get to that. So the readability of a game, like we were saying, it greatly affects how well we're able to plan ahead, right? So, in the word search example, if we made all the letters, different colors, or we made them bounce around the screen, it'd be really, really hard to read. And so it would just be harder to pick stuff out. It would be harder to play the game that we're trying to play. And so games with information that's hidden or hard to read make looking ahead much more difficult, even for a really fluent player. And so this is what we call the information horizon, right? It's how far, the distance in time that the player is able to practically look ahead. So a game like Hearthstone would demand that we consider how our plan will affect the state of the game several moves ahead. It's important to playing this game that I can sort of say, well, in 5 moves, I'm going to be able to play this card. But in Hearthstone, you can't over certain what cards we're going to have in the future, or what your opponent has and is going to have in the future. So we can't really look very far with any accuracy. So what this game is saying is, sure, you can hope that in 5 turns you'll be able to do this thing, but you wouldn't want to bet on it. You probably wouldn't want to look ahead more than 2 turns, really, or even like as far as I'm going to hopefully do this thing in 1 turn's time or 2 turns' time. Because anything else past that point is subject to so much randomness, basically. You can't say it with any authority. And it's the same here, right? There's not much hidden information, but the patterns are made hard to spot, and each move changes the board in these really complicated ways. So, if I decided to match I don't know, what's a good example here? Let's say I match in the middle, there's 3 purples, right? If I match those, it's going to change like 30 things or something on the board. It's going to be a massive, massive effect. And I literally can't imagine that in my head, how this board will look. So I can't even see 1 move ahead. And this is why you don't often see people, really thinking ahead in these games, is because it's just so bloody difficult. And I think this is the reason that the designers of Match 3 games don't incentivize you planning several moves ahead. And they could reward players for skilled play, which is this thing that most games really would like to do. But I think they don't do it because it would make the game difficult to play. It would make it too frustrating. It would ask too much of the player. So chess, on the other hand, is a game where skilled players consider hundreds of potential outcomes of a move, several turns into the future. And chess actively supports this kind of play in lots of ways, right? So the board is small, the grid is easy to read, there aren't many types of pieces, they're very easy to differentiate, and a turn will only change the position of 1 piece. And the result of this is that chess is a game where players can easily spend several minutes to take a turn, considering the outcomes of, if I do this, they'll do this, then I'll do this, then I'll do this, then I'll do this. And each time they think of a move ahead, the possibility space expands. Well, if I do this, actually, no, they could do this, or they could do this. I'd like them to do this. So let's pretend they do this, and then we'll keep going. But now let's come back to what will happen if they do this other thing. Okay, well, let's see what happens. So you're creating, this is literally how chess AIs work, because they build like a heuristic tree and saying, what's the best thing that the opponent could do if I were to do this? Okay, now keep running that and tell me what the best thing that could happen and the worst thing that could happen in 10 moves time. And this is how we play chess, and it really does take a long time for people to do. Computers are quite good at it, and this is why chess could theoretically go on for a really long time, and this is why we have chess clocks, and I think the longest sort of chess game that you're allowed to do is not as long as I thought it was. I can't actually remember, but it's like 100 minutes or something. I can't remember.
Well, it's also the reason why masters at some point have a look at the board right, or dead somewhere in the middle, and they're like, okay, I lost, concede.
Yeah, right, exactly, because they can just look so far ahead. They know that, like, assuming the other player doesn't make a mistake, which you can assume at that kind of play level, then yeah, probably lost. Never mind. Which is a really cool thing, right? Like, it's awesome when a player looks at something that you don't understand and says, "Oh yeah, I've lost." That's really fun. So far, I focused on games without much time pressure because they make easier examples. But actually, no, most of the most popular games are in real time with tests to how quickly players can read what's happening, as well as how fast they can react to it and then execute and move. So coming back to League of Legends, which is an immensely difficult game to read because of the massive amount of things that exists in this game. There's so much stuff. Like, just looking at this screenshot, oh my god, it's so much information. Like, I've been playing League of Legends for a while, and I still just sort of pausing around the screen. Okay, it looks like no one's got any turrets. They've got about the same amount of gold. There's no deaths. Been about 3 minutes in. It looks like their top lane is going back. Oh, so much stuff. And this is happening in real time, right? So to get really good at this, you need to understand all this information and then still have enough brain space left over to make calculated decisions about it, which is, I think, basically impossible even for a fluent player. So this is a game that it's interesting because it's basically overwhelming how much stuff there is on screen. You're having to make very in the same way that when we read a textbook or something like that, we can kind of skim over the bits that we're not interested in and we can sort of search for stuff. The same thing is happening here, where a good player knows exactly what they need to pay attention to and exactly which things they only need to check once in a while. And that might still cost them. They might still make a mistake there because something happened in a place they weren't expecting. But they'll understand over time this kind of pattern of, I haven't seen the enemy's jungler in a while, which means they might come out soon, which might be a problem for me. So maybe I need to play defensive here, or just understanding, they took dragon a while ago, which means I need to watch out for this kind of character. So there's just so much to pay attention to. And what happened to me when I started playing Legends is events would happen way faster than I was able to literally just read what was going on. And you're in this state where you're totally unable to plan or execute anything. And this is the definition of panic in a game, is when stuff happens faster than you can comprehend it. And that's when, as I'm sure most of you will be familiar with, you mash the keyboard, stuff happens, and you die because you just can't keep up. And that's one of the key things of learning this kind of game is, just literally being able to keep up with what's happening. So I wanted to dig into this, actually, this kind of process of how you learn a game in the first place and how that relates to reading it, because learning to read a game is actually this massive part of what makes it entertaining and is certainly a big part of the player experience, right? Like, you want to be consciously designing to build something where players are learning the right things at the right time. So League of Legends is a really good example of this because it requires a massive player literacy to the point where you can play, I think you could play like tens of thousands of hours and still see new situations, still see new patterns. And I don't think there are many games that exist that can claim that. And so the process of learning this game is immensely long and still immensely rewarding. So a beginner who has never played League of Legends before, first thing that they learn is the very fundamentals required to play the game, right? Like, they learn that, that's a health bar. Oh, okay, I have 5 teammates. I understand that, that's an attack. Oh, they can do this attack. Oh, they can stun me, right? So they're learning this new information. But this is all fundamental information. These aren't really patterns as such, like, understanding that this thing might happen around this time or that this thing might mean that this will happen. It's literally just the raw input of, like, this shape means this. Enemies can attack. Really simple stuff. So they don't understand these deeper patterns. And they're not enabled to make any clever decisions at all. And actually, this can be really frustrating, right? So, you encounter a new champion and they do this move and then you die. And you didn't know that can happen. And it doesn't feel fair. You do know it the next time, though. So the next time this happens, you might have a chance. But if this happens a lot, if this kind of constant new stuff that's just randomly killing you as far as you're aware, you might quit here. And I think this is why it's so important for games to have strong onboarding for this kind of thing. To its credit, League of Legends does have a tutorial, although it might not be entirely enough, because it's a game that relies so much on like the literacy of a player. Certainly, League of Legends was born out of the Warcraft community, which has many of the same ideas, which was born out of something else, which was born out of something else. So as they learn, they become novices, right? And at this point, they're able to spot patterns, like new patterns in the game. They don't, they understand what the moves do, and now they understand. Oh, well, if they do this thing, then they also tend to do this at around the same time. Or maybe they understand that when the enemy backs, maybe that's a good time to push the lane up. Or I haven't seen the jungler in a while, I should probably stay near turret, right? You're learning these patterns and there's hundreds of these, and if you wrote them down, there'd be too many to list, and they're these things you kind of just internalize. And this is really fun, like really fun, because when the jungler does come out for the first time and you are sitting by the turret and maybe you're even able to turn it around and you're able to get a kill, that feels incredible because you learned something the first time because you were punished by it. And then you learned to read that situation better, and now you can deal with it. And at this stage, there's so much new stuff that you're able to deal with that it's just immensely rewarding. And occasionally, you're even able to make good decisions, which is, again, rewarding because you might even win sometimes. And I think this is something that designers should always pay attention to, is like, this is the learning curve of the game, understanding at what point players will encounter things and how to make that encounter interesting, and how to give the player a chance, and how to make sure that the next time they see it, they're able to learn from it. I think this is the sort of thing that designers need to consciously think about when they're building a tutorial, but also generally thinking about how the game unfolds in the first place. So next up, the player is an intermediate. They're pretty good. They're a competent player. They can read the game really quite efficiently. They're not doing stupid things. They understand the significance of more abstract happenings in the game, like so exercising their ability it's familiar at this point, and it's satisfying. Although it's less rewarding perhaps than it was, because there are less thrills that come with learning stuff. Like you're rarely in a situation where something that killed you last time, you've learned to understand what that was, and now when you see it again, you're able to turn it around. That doesn't happen so much because you're so often able to, you've done this a few times. It's just less interesting. So now you're focusing more on the decision making of the game. And then finally you become an expert, right? And at this point, you've got the most complex patterns that the game can offer. And what was once a creative decision has become basically just another word. You know exactly how to deal with every situation, and so you just read it. You don't need to look at something and then try to comprehend what that means. You don't need to do any planning really at all. Something happens and you just respond. You understand what it means innately, and that you understand what you have to do without really having to consider it. And at this point, the decision space reduces massively until the game is just solved, right? And at this point, the real appeal at this point is all the other bits of the game, like maybe there's still decision making, maybe there's still execution challenge, and maybe there's randomness to comprehend. But this is typically the point where you fall off a game, right? Or you just play it because it's familiar and snug, which is fine. But at this point, a lot of players will quit, or else they'll go into something else, like maybe they'll play it professionally, or they'll teach others how to play it. There was one more thing that I wanted to cover before I wrap up, which was I wanted to look at a few turn-based tactics games, sort of games that are in the same genre, and I wanted to have a look at how they use reading in different ways, and how much of what you're doing as you play this game is reading versus planning versus executing. So the first example I wanted to give is a game called Hoplite. It's a brilliant game. You can download it for your phone, and in this game, you can move any of the directions. You have a couple of special moves as well. There's not many things you can do. So what you're trying to do here is you're trying to work out what the enemies are able to do, because the game doesn't show you that. You have to learn it, and you have to learn how to read it. So the wizard guy with the staff on the right, he'll shoot you next turn unless you move out of the way. The guy with the sword who's just below you, he'll stab you if you don't move out of the way. There's a bomb next to you as well, and there's also an archer. If you moved bottom left here, he'd shoot you. So you need to find a move that gets around that. Probably the best move here is to jump over the guy with the sword. But when I was working out what to do there, almost all of that was reading, right? Like I was just looking at the board and working out what possibly, you know, where are the squares where I'll be in danger if I end up here. And then as soon as I had that, I could just say, right, need to do this. There aren't many decisions left at the point where I've worked out where I can and can't go. So this is a game that's mostly reading, right? Which is really interesting. And I think it says quite a lot to why I played a lot of this game for a while. And then I kind of just sort of basically felt like I'd solved it. I had this sense of like, I've seen everything this game has to offer. And that's because the actual strategic depth of this game is really quite shallow, but rather there's a lot of, it's interesting to play because reading is interesting. And that's how this game appeals. Fire Emblem is another turn-based tactics game, but it's very different. So this is a game with way more stuff happening. There's way more enemies. They can move. You know, you've got a whole party of guys. They will have different abilities, different strengths, different levels. There's loads of numbers. There is so much more going on. And typically the way that people play these games is they click around a lot and they get a sense of what I can do by just kind of testing out, what if I move my archer there? How much damage will I do against this guy? What about this guy? What about this guy? What if I move them back? How much damage will they do to me if they're sat there at the end of the turn? How many enemies will be able to attack them? There's a huge amount of information. And a lot of it is buried behind moving and testing something as well. So you can't literally just look at it like you could the last game. But you are still reading. It's just you're having to take action. So there's just so much more to read. Fortunately, Fire Emblem makes this way easier. They show you what the enemy, can attack and what they can't attack. They even show you now who they're going to attack. So this is completely different to Hoplite, where Hoplite was asking you to do that as part of the reading phase. Fire Emblem is giving you that for free because they know that without that, it would be a game with way more reading. So they're deliberately holding back on some of the reading that they could have had, and in fact had before they consciously put this in, so that you focus more on the strategic element, so that you focus more on the decision making. Who am I going to put here, knowing that this cell isn't safe, that it will be attacked by this enemy and this enemy. Into the Breach. Into the Breach is really interesting because they show you everything that's going to happen during a single turn. And so you have perfect information. This is a puzzle game. It's about understanding exactly what can and cannot be done. So this is a really interesting example, actually. So finally, we have chess. Again, chess is a really interesting example because of its depth. So in chess, separating the stupid moves from those that you'd consider worth doing, that is low level play. Literally just working out where I can go that I won't get clobbered immediately by somebody. That is how beginners play. And at this point, if you lose a game just by failing to spot something, that's how you would expect to win or lose a game at that level. But when you get to a higher level in chess, that doesn't happen. Nobody makes mistakes like this because the reading, you're so good at reading that you just you never fall into the trap of, accidentally putting, your queen in the open. It just doesn't happen. And because of this, because it allows players to get this damned good at reading, you're able to get incredibly, you're able to move your focus to the planning phase. And this is why players can get so incredibly good at chess, is because they can look so far ahead and because they can spend so much time planning rather than reading the game. It's hard to stress just how significant that is about chess being a competitive game, that it really enables this kind of evergreen play. But I'm going to wrap up there. So I'm going to leave you with a few things to think about, just for funsies. I don't have necessarily answers to these, but I think they're fun things to consider.
A lot of these, first, thanks for the presentation. And I think a lot of these are very much focused on, I'll turn our cameras back on.
Yeah.
Leave the questions on as well.
Okay.
I just put our cameras on top of that.
Okay.
There we go. So that should work. Okay, so yeah, thanks for the presentation. Thanks a lot for this. What we actually got quite a few comments as you were talking, but I didn't want to I didn't want to interrupt you because you're on a roll there. So one of them says, well, actually, RTS real-time strategy games are the worst for reading, and I'm guessing part of that was games like League of Legends as well, where somebody said it's like that gorilla and basketball experiment where people can only really focus on one thing.
Yeah, right. I think that's totally true. There's so a concept I didn't raise that maybe I should have done is that I think reading or learning to read is often the process of discerning signal from noise, right? There's just a load of stuff, you can't make any sense of it, and you slowly pick out patterns, and eventually you start being able to, it's like tuning into a radio. You start understanding what this thing actually is. But there's just so much noise in League of Legends that it's so easy to completely miss something just because there's so much other information that is meaningless happening at the same time or is less important or you didn't think to tune into. It's just so much going on. I think that's a really interesting quality about those games. Like, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that a game presents you with more stuff to read than you're able to read, because obviously it infinitely increases the skill ceiling, because no matter how good you get at reading, at sort of expecting things to be in the places that, you expect to look and all this kind of thing, you'll never master it. Which obviously is a really good fit for a competitive game. Although, yeah, it does make it really, really hard to read, and it does mean that sometimes you'll die and it's almost bad feedback, right? Like you were playing really well and then something happens that you didn't really expect. And I think there's a paradox there in a way, and I think it's sort of up for the designer to say, do you want this quality in your game? Like, it will lead to some bad outcomes, but it will also massively increase the long-term playability, I suppose.
Yeah, because like at some point you have to think about the learning curve of your game, right? And readability is part of that.
Yeah.
Somebody else says, well, if you look at a game like WoW, where you have a lot of UI, right? We had a short chat about there being third-party plugins which actually showed you extra information on the screen if you needed it.
Oh, wow.
Like the timers that you mentioned, like the timers used to be a third-party plugin for League of Legends, and WoW used to
No
have a
way.
lot of these as well.
Oh,
But yeah, as somebody mentioned, having a game that's, say, very heavy on VFX, on particle effects, on special effects, that can lead to the game being harder to read. Because you just have a lot more things on the screen that your brain has to parse, especially if they might not be tuned for accessibility, as we were talking to Lisha last week.
I think that's a really good point. I think this is another topic in some ways, but I've often wondered the effect of different skins in League of Legends, because they affect the how moves look and how characters look. And I'm not particularly good at League of Legends, but I've often played a game where halfway through I realized, oh, I'm playing against Miss Fortune, but she's got like a beach outfit on. I didn't think that was how she looked. And I mean, arguably, this is another thing to learn to read, right? But it's hard because it just makes things harder to discern. And I think there's probably, I don't know, there's somebody out there's probably worked this out. I bet there are some skins that are just slightly harder to read. They look noisier, they're less clear, and they're probably the strategic edge.
The
if you're really
camouflage skins. Yeah,
I've never seen anyone write about this, but I bet there are certain skins that are slightly more competitively viable, even though they are designed, purposefully not to make any difference to the gameplay.
Yeah, exactly, and that would be really interesting. And I think mechanics changing at the same time can be a really big part of this. And we can talk endlessly about how Fortnite's whole model is let's change the mechanics with every new season, every new big patch, because
Right.
that's going to keep the game fresh as well as keeping it constantly interesting for streamers, right? Because as you were mentioned, as you mentioned. Streaming is a big part of that, a big part of the games industry at the moment. Commentators are a really big part of the games industry at the moment, and them talking to you about what's happening in the game is quite enjoyable. I mean, that's what they're there for, right?
Mm. Yeah, I think that's really true. So the question I put up there, how do commentators help us to read games? I don't have a good answer for that, but I think it is really interesting that they are basically, that's what they're telling us, right? They're telling us this is a thing to pay attention to, or this is the thing that's happening, or this is my analysis of the situation. Um, I find that utterly fascinating that I mean, that's their job, right? Is to be more informed than us so they can tell us what's really happening.
Yeah, Andrew says, very nice presentation. Thanks a lot for this. And somebody, Mircha says, another interesting thing I noticed in a few games is increasing difficulty by offering the player less info through the UI or forcing them to read the information themselves. So
that's really interesting. I'm genuinely struggling to think of an example of that, but or at least a good example of that. But that's really, really cool, actually. Because yeah, that's an obviously great way to make a game more challenging. For example, if you took away the League of Legends timers, right? Like if you couldn't get a plugin for it, all of a sudden that's a skill that you have to learn. You have to know when things are going to happen. There was a really nice Mario level where like I can't remember how it works. And that was it. You have like a radius around you, and everything in that radius, you can't see platforms. So you have to look ahead, see where the platforms are, but then when you get near them, they vanish, but they're still there. So you have to read the space really carefully so that when you approach it, you know where it is without being able to see it. And I think that's one of the few examples of that I can actually think about. And it's proven to be fun, right? Like it works there really well. Although I suppose it can be frustrating, but it's maybe an extreme example. I'd love to know what her examples were.
his. But yeah, I'm sure that Mircha is going to give us a few examples. The one that comes to mind immediately, I'm sure that Mircha is going to get us a few examples soon. But the one that comes to mind immediately is Assassin's Creed, where you can actually disable parts of the UI to make the game more difficult. So you don't want the map, okay? Then you don't want a mini map, so you disable that. You don't want like to see that Skyrim-like marker of your next marker is your next quest is that way, right? So you can disable that.
Yeah, sure.
And then you get into this Dark Souls-like environment where it's just like you working off of cues, which are visual, which are like animations and sound, as opposed to having UI elements, which is like this enemy is gonna attack. And we also Quint somebody says RTS games are much more readable when you actually have all of the information on one screen. I can manage a much higher number of actions per minute in something like Total War, where all of the information is on the screen, as opposed to StarCraft 2, uh, where things uh,
Yeah,
where things are slightly more hidden.
yeah, I think that's really true. So, an anecdote. I grew up on Nintendo. I never had access to PC games, so I was never able to play RTS games at all. And League of Legends is my first time I've really got into this kind of game. And when I first started playing it, my first reaction was, "This is stupid. I have to watch the map to play the game. Everything is happening on the map. That's where the real game is. Except the map is tiny and I can barely see it." But it's really important. So I'm basically having to flip between these two screens. And like, imagine if I had a really big screen and I could just see everything happening at once. That would be, in my head, a significantly better game. Um, and I suspect the reason that they don't have this is partly legacy and also partly because nobody has a giant screen. But it does seem obvious to me that, yeah, like having to flit around the screen in the way that you kind of expect in that kind of game is, I think, bad. I don't think that's an interesting type of reading, is kind of like expecting players to have to click around a minimap. I don't see why that's interesting, personally. But yeah, I think it's an affordance of like the sort of games that require a large amount of space, I suppose.
Yeah. And Andrew says, I actually remember a horror to the top-down shooter game where if you saw the monsters, the lights would turn off and you'd have to remember your way out as you can't see the pathway.
That's evil. That is terrifying. I'm glad I never played that.
Yeah. Also, apparently, Far Cry Primal, Ghost Recon Wildlands, Metro have modes where you can actually reduce the UI, so
Mm.
you don't see the number of bullets in your magazine. You don't see the minimap. Um, Andrew says, I remember Modern Warfare 2 had a hardcore mode where there was no UI. So I'm guessing like this plays a lot with the difficulty, and again, this is really good about giving the players options in terms of being able to turn visibility off and on again.
Yeah.
And I think just kind of like to wrap up because we've ran a bit over. Um, Here a big part of this is understanding who your target audience is and actually playtesting, right? So as a game designer, that's why playtesting is important, is because as you were saying, where you or I may be mediocre at something like League of Legends, we still understand what's going on, right? But my mom would have no idea, right?
Yeah.
So it's really important when you're making a game that you make a sort of a conscious note about what type of gamers you're targeting, and then you actually get them in to see if your assumptions are correct in terms of how they read the game, right?
I think that's absolutely true.
But yeah, okay. Any other thoughts from you, Tom, before we end?
No, I've had my say. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think that's about it then. We are going to have our next talk 2 weeks from now on a Wednesday. And we're actually going to talk about community management and how you design a game for community engagement with Mike Rose from No More Robots.
Ooh, that
So,
sounds good.
so yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in tonight and looking forward to seeing you in the next Game Anglia talk. Thanks a lot.